The political commentator and Conservative councillor Noah Khogali is here. Noah, good morning.
Morning, Rosie. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Weight loss jabs, I think there's sort of been an air, a bit of cynicism around them, or almost a bit of snobbery for people to say, oh, those are people losing weight without being able to sort of use willpower. We are learning more about how they may utterly transform our health, our healthcare system, even so much of our business world and lifestyle as people's sort of appetites reduce fairly significantly. Expert believes these jabs also potentially stop cancer by reducing inflammation, cut the risk of half. I mean, it's quite remarkable.
It really is quite exciting, isn't it? And I do think you're right that there has been an element of, I think snobbery is probably the right word, because it almost sounds like it's too easy. I think we're always cynical about the idea of, a silver bullet. And this does seem like it might be not a silver bullet yet, but getting towards that. And anything that's going to, benefit us in the fight against cancer, really, really, really exciting. And it does sound like this is more Ozempic, similar drugs could be more effective than surgery, for example, for obesity-related cancers specifically, which are massively on the rise, and something that researchers are incredibly interested in.
Yeah, so some of the initial findings are that weight loss drugs could cut the risk of getting cancer by half, and they might help stop tumours from actually forming in non-obese people, which is interesting. Someone who didn't have such a great success story was Jeremy Clarkson, who wrote in the Sunday Times yesterday his experience of being on Ozempic, which was a highly entertaining read. But there we go, some huge step forwards in our health. Let's look at the front page of The Guardian, Noah, and this story about nurses and frustration, really, I think, from them to say, look, we want strike. We will go on strike because we feel there's been a 25% erosion in our pay. What's happening? What's sort of the heart of the debate here?
No, this feels a little bit like Groundhog Day, I suppose. There's a 2.5% pay rise offer on the table, but obviously their argument is that since 2010, their pay's been eroded by 25%, and ultimately for other people, especially in the medical arena, striking has worked quite well in getting what they want out of maybe the previous government or this government, and that's why it's still on the table. And that's always the risk, I suppose, when someone does start striking, that if you concede and concede to their demands, that everyone else is going to start striking as well. And we've seen that a little bit from the BMA, who I think are balloting again, specifically citing that it was successful for them in the past. So this is something the government's got to get on top of. And obviously there is a lot of Labour MPs, when this happened under the Conservatives, who will probably have some quotes that they're going to try and roll back on quite quickly about the needing support nurses. But when faced with the reality of being in government and having to balance those books, are going to probably take quite a different tack.
Remember that the junior doctors, we now call them resident doctors in England, were previously asking for a 35% pay rise. It could be that nurses say, look, we want a 25% pay rise, because that's what they say. I think if they went on strike, that would be their opening negotiating position. They say that's sort of been the real term erosion over the last 15 years in terms of their pay. No, I think what is very difficult is when Labour came into power, solving the strikes was their sort of number one task, and they did that. But now it's much more challenging to do if those same people just 1 year later say, we go on strike again. You then inherit the problems the previous government really was sort of hamstrung by.
Yeah, and I suppose this is part of the challenge about trying to win an election and not necessarily be the best government that you could be in the future. You can say lots of things and, not really get into the granular detail of why, the NHS has funding issues, and just say, look, I'm going to come and fix that problem when I'm in government and it's going to be fine. And you don't really, obviously, in opposition, have to demonstrate how you're practically going to do that. It obviously is a bad look, and Labour have had a number of challenges since they've come in, which essentially have been related to that same issue, including the housing supply issue that I'm sure we're going to talk about, where they essentially just promised to fix it and didn't really have a practical plan about how that was going to happen.
Or a longer term plan, at least, to say. I think they were hoping that the economy would be in a slightly healthier, better place, rather than sort of grappling with the lack of growth that we are in, which makes all these problems more tricky. It's interesting, Noah, that you mentioned sort of, some of those Labour MPs that may struggle with things they'd said before in support of striking workers. And we know actually the Labour Party have had traditionally, and even just I'd say of the last year or so, quite a healthy relationship with the unions. Inside the politics part of the paper today, Tom Peck has been writing about sort of with a little bit of a humour laden in there as well, but the sort of increasing factions within the Labour Party, the different groups, the Red Wall group, the Corbynistas, the Growth group, that actually, there's an awful lot of these Labour MPs and there are some quite clear areas of division in how they'd want to deal with things like strike action.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the risks of a very wide but very shallow majority, is that there are now there's a lot of Labour MPs, a lot of them are new, and they have split into factions in the same way as the Conservatives found that after that huge Boris Johnson victory, they've formed mini parties within themselves that they've not, necessarily done as much as the Conservatives did last time in terms of infighting, but it certainly looked like they'll get there. And Keir Starmer has often attracted the wrath of some of the left of his party for being perceived to have gone on these purge sprees and got rid of them. But ultimately, when you're in government and trying to get on with the job of governing, you have less time to potentially focus on the people within your own party who may not be your biggest fans.
How does the Prime Minister try and sort of unite what is inevitably going to be a party of differing opinion when you've got so many MPs?
It's hard. And when he's arguing for, more frugality when it comes to the economy, he's not only speaking to the public, but he's also speaking to members of his own party. And those are the people, there's not going to be an election anytime soon, so those are the people that can do him the most damage at the moment. But he's also going to be keeping one eye on the likes of Reform and the likes of the Conservatives, knowing that later down the line, that's also a risk he needs to balance. And it's incredibly difficult and incredibly tricky and going to take a huge amount of political nous, I think.
And it's a Prime Minister getting increasingly tougher on legal migration. We're going to hear from him at 8:30 this morning. Front page of the paper saying migrants must earn their right to remain. Particularly, Reform is pushing Labour ever so slightly towards the right, which may sort of make some Labour MPs feel a bit green and queasy. Let's talk about the house building, as you mentioned it. Piece inside the Times today saying, this is the Whitehall editor saying, the Labour Party have admitted that a steep rise in house building is needed to hit the targets. Ambitious targets from the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner to build 1.5 million new homes. They will have to build then, in effect, 370,000 homes a year from 2027. That's more than double the current rate. That doesn't look likely, does it?
No, absolutely not. And this is, I think, a huge concern for the industry, that the government are essentially arguing, or they're hoping that they're going to have one of those hockey stick charts where it kind of pooters along and then house building rapidly rises at the very end of this term. That doesn't seem likely, I'd suggest. And I think something the government does really need to start considering is the impact that environmental regulations, for example, are having on smaller house builders, and that something like water neutrality, for example, when a house builder essentially needs to offset the amount of water that a new housing development is going to be used locally and purchase potentially water credits or investment into other properties, something like that is a huge pressure on smaller house builders. And at the moment, I think there's probably a risk that regulations like that are only really feasible for the larger developers, and that's possibly pushing down a little bit on those numbers.
Final thing we should talk about, away from politics, just for a moment or two, is the BAFTAs. I don't know if you watched any of it last night, Noah, but it's a moment to just sort of take stock of the brilliant TV of the last year or so. And I think perhaps unsurprisingly, Mr. Bates v. the Post Office came out on top. They were nominated for 6 awards, won limited drama series. It is so brilliant when you get something that is equally entertaining and compelling, but also had real societal impact.
And that's the perfect balance, I think, isn't it? I'm not in writing myself, but I'm sure that's what everyone yearns for, is something that has massive impact and imprints on the public memory. But it was also a wonderful bit of television. And massive congratulations to everyone involved, because that's what everyone in that industry wants. I mean, it's something everybody was talking about, and it's a massive achievement.
Yeah, and actually real frustration still at some of the problems of compensation, and lots of the former sub-postmasters questioning why it has taken so long, or they've been given offers of compensation that are not what the independent body recommended. So that story, tragically, still continues. The Traitors didn't win the award they were up for, which I think they were disappointed about. Neither did Netflix's One Day. But there were some absolutely glorious celebrations last night. Blue Lights won Best Drama, International Drama, Shogun on Disney+. That's brilliant. So lots of inspiration for us. Noah, thank you so much. Noah Khogali, the political commentator and Conservative councillor. Thank you very much.